Sirs, Ma'ams, ladies and gentlemen, I am Lance Corporal Andy Burkitt, a Cal Secondee, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce the third speaker of this morning, Mr. John Manzoni. Mr. Manzoni has more than 30 years' experience in the private sector, beginning his 24-year career as a petroleum engineer with BP in the 1980s. He now holds the position of Chief Executive of the Civil Service. And in addition to this role, Mr. Manzoni is also Permanent Secretary, responsible for the leadership and governance of the Cabinet Office, as they support the Prime Minister and ensure the effective and efficient running of the UK government. Please join me in welcoming Mr. John Manzoni to the stage.
Well, do you mind if I take my job? Am I allowed to do that? Well, it's nice to see you. Thank you for having me. I must admit, I am not a professional management speaker. So, let's just try that. I was asked to come and talk about change and give you a personal perspective about change. So I'm very happy to do that. It's actually rather a pleasant change from doing Brexit, actually, which is what otherwise has to happen. So it's rather nice coming down the motorway. I'm very happy to come and chat about this for the morning. A little bit about me, and I'll tell you why that's relevant. I am currently the Chief Executive of the Civil Service. That sounds terribly grand. Like everything else in government, it's a bit more complicated. I am, in fact, the Chief Executive of the Civil Service, but I'm a bit of a novice in the public sector. I've been in the public sector 4 or 5 years. As you heard, I spent 30 years actually in the oil industry, the last 5 of which was running an international company out of North America, and before that, 25 years at BP, the last 5 or 7 of those on the main board at BP. And the reason I tell you that is because what I'm really trying to do is to bring some of that business experience into the civil service, into the public sector. And I'll illuminate why. What I find in the public sector is, and particularly the civil service, is some fantastic, wonderful, dedicated people. Actually a sense of public service that any company would be incredibly proud to have, that sort of streak of clear mission that I find in the public sector. They're also frighteningly bright. But I'm going to spend some time this morning talking to you about what I'm trying to do inside the civil service to change how the public sector works, how it runs, and the reason I give you that little bit of sort of background is because, of course, one has to use one's own experience. And of course, my first point, leadership always exists in a context. It doesn't exist as a theoretical construct. It only exists in context, in a particular context. So I thought I would describe what we're doing in the civil service and then draw from that a few thoughts for you. Since I was asked to give a personal perspective, I don't have any right to give you a personal perspective, but since I'm on the stage and you're there, you're going to listen and I'm going to talk. So that's okay. So I arrived in the actually was curious. I didn't come to do this job at all. I came to do something about the major projects, run the major projects across government. And then 6 months in, they said, you know, we want you to be the chief executive. I said, what's that? They said, well, we don't know. We were hoping you'd tell us. So it's a sort of new role. But I had made 2 or 3 pretty fundamental observations about what I saw as I arrived into the civil service. The first point is that, of course, the fiscal envelope for the public sector is just like doing this. Those of you in uniforms will recognise that. It's the same everywhere. There's not enough money, more and more demand. You know, demand function doing this, money doing that. And in the years between about 2010 and about 2013, the civil service had just basically shrunk 20%. I mean, it was just sort of squeezed out. So it tells you there was a certain amount of fat, I would say, if you can just push down and you can move 20% out. But the truth is, we had run out of road. We were continuing on a fiscal envelope doing that. Demand for public services is getting higher and higher. Demands on the public sector getting higher and higher. And so we needed to create there was a bust. We couldn't just beat the horses and say run faster work harder, that wasn't really going to work. So observation 1 was that. Observation 2, I have never seen such a stunningly siloed place as the public sector. This is like industry 20 years ago. So we are a constitutional barony. We have departments of state. I mean, it is unbelievable that we have, these we have 28 vertical silos, and actually, that's pretty extraordinary when you come from an organisation, which is big global companies, running in a matrix structure. So that was my second observation. You can imagine how popular these were when I was making them. The third observation was that the civil service, in my view, had essentially atrophied its execution skills. It started with outsourcing, all very sensible, 10 or 15 years ago, but essentially over the years, those skills of execution and delivery and implementation had essentially atrophied out of the civil service, and that has lots and lots of connotations. It was concentrating on policy. It was an intellectual activity concentrating on policy, and that has a very interesting impact and effect, because in my view it starts to distort the leadership model. Civil service is about 400,000 people. This is a big organisation, but the problem with concentrating on policy as an organisation of 400,000 people, of course, it's never yours. The politicians own that agenda. They are elected to define the policies. And if you start to define yourself about the quality of advice to ministers, then you can imagine over time how the leadership model starts to become distorted about what's important. Well, actually, what's important is the intellectualism with which I deploy that advice, the time I spend in front of ministers. How much time can I be in front of the minister? Because, after all, my advice is the best. In my experience, and then you can pretty quickly see how an organisation can start to look upwards to all the ministers, to all the politicians. And if you, in my experience, if you, at the top of very big organisations, start to look upwards, pretty soon I got 400,000 people looking upwards. And last time I checked, you don't deliver much looking upwards. You deliver looking forwards, looking downwards, looking outwards. You do not deliver looking upwards. And over time, one can imagine that you can create the start of a parent-child relationship between the civil service of this country, which actually, I keep reminding them, is implementing things for a generation. There's nothing we do that doesn't last generations in the civil service. Last time I checked, the politicians come and go with fairly regular frequency. And of course we're here to serve the politicians, of course we're here to serve the government of the day. But if the civil service does not create for itself something that it owns, and it is there wholly and only to provide advice upwards, at least in the decision-making parts, you can imagine the problem. So that was my sort of third or fourth. I mean, it's related to my third observation about the nature of the civil service. And that, for me, was what really persuaded me to say, actually, I will take the job of Chief Executive of the Civil Service, because actually, I believe this country needs better, and I do not believe that the trajectory of a civil service, which is, by the way, stunningly, stunningly bright, and I've told you, stunningly, stunningly dedicated. By the way, the civil service, I've never worked harder in my life in the last 4 or 5 years in the civil service. The top of the civil service, it is really, really busy, especially now, but it is really busy. So there's nothing about people shirking off and having an easy life, but there was something fundamentally wrong in my judgment, which we have to start putting right. So I chose to, the question is then what to do. So actually what I chose to do is I chose to address those issues by implementing the structure. I mean, it just comes from experience. Everywhere I know is organised in some sort of a matrix. There's some sort of a matrix. Sometimes it's functional, sometimes it's regional, sometimes it's product brand, and its operating line. All companies I've ever worked in operate in some sort of a matrix, except governments, it turns out. They operate in vertical silos. So what we've essentially done is introduce a functional matrix across the civil service we have. So I started, I see you look around and say, well, we need some functional leaders. So I say, well, I better go and get the head of HR to find something. There wasn't a head of HR, so I had to hire a head of HR. That was the first thing. And then we had to hire a head of commercial, and then a head of technology, and a head of projects, head of finance, head of legal, all of those things. And we have now created these structures, these functional structures right across the civil service. And what do they do, of course? They do lots of things. They are an axis through which we can repopulate those professional skills back into the civil service so that we can hire commercial people, we can hire project people, we can hire financial people, we can repopulate those delivery skills into the civil service. That's the first thing they do. The second thing they do, they're the only structure which cuts right through the 28 silos. We can see right through those silos, and through that construct, we can, of course, create shared platforms, technology platforms. We paid people, and we had 28 ways of paying people. With a front office and a back office and a plan. So now we've got one, okay? And that's a clue into how we can make it more efficient, of course, as well. And of course, ultimately, we can reintroduce some standards. We can put some, this is how you do a commercial contract. And you can see all that in the newspapers. You might have read the gagging clause and stuff. They're not actually gagging clauses. They're for a different reason. But we can start creating standards across the system. We can say, actually, this is how we do this. And that, of course, progressively professionalizes the point of delivery in the civil service. So these functions, they were simply a construct. They were an axis. Actually, they were the only... Actually, I was chief executive of the civil service. I had absolutely nobody to report to me. I had no power. None of the permanent secretaries of the 28 things reported to me, so I thought, Christ, I better get somebody to report to me, so I had to hire these functions to do it. So now I've got a team, which feels a lot better. But of course, it's enabled us to begin that transformation that I was talking about. It's enabled us to start. We needed an axis to stop just the next efficiency drive and start the fundamental transformation of the civil service. So, every public service now is being digitized. So those of you with cars, you can do it all online. That's a little DVLA. Everything to do with the driving licenses and stuff is now done online. But every single service is being progressively digitized. We're modernizing all of those services, all of that. There's some really big changes going on. You'll have read about universal credit. But this is a major change. It isn't just a front-end digital. It isn't just bringing 6 or 7 benefits together. Actually, what it's doing is it's changing the way 60,000 or so civil servants across the benefits and pensions department are working. It changes the work that they do. So you can imagine the big changes. The personal tax account, the online tax. Imagine the world we're going to be soon where we're paying taxes as we go. Isn't that a joy? Anyway, but it will be more modern. These are big changes. Universal Credit's taken 5 or 6 years, multiple hundreds of millions of pounds, and it's saving billions. It's saving billions. It's also creating the right incentives to get people out of work into work. So it's the right thing to do, and it's really, really hard to get it done. But they're big, fundamental, transformative changes. We've started creating joint offices. Turns out the government owns 63% of the centre of Bromsgrove. That is because we have a whole bunch of really old buildings half full. And it's happening all over the country, and I've visited all over the country, and they're dreadful, dreadful buildings. And of course, so what we've got to do is we've got to modernise them. We've announced 13 or 15 hubs so far. 35,000 civil servants have been impacted by those 15 or 16 hubs. We've got about another 20 hubs to announce the physical manifestation of these changes, breaking down these silos, making departments work together, changing the barriers, all of that stuff is starting to happen. There are massive, I have the privilege of being able to sit across the top of the government and look across the system. There are levels of change going on in the civil service that any company would deem totally and utterly irresponsible. as do I in private moments, but it is enormous change going across our civil service, modernising, making it more effective, making it more citizen-centric, digitised. Most of it's underpinned by technology in one way or another, but not all. And so all coming through, and of course at the same time, building these skills down these functional axes. We've hired hundreds of senior commercial people. And what's great about it, of course, about a year into when I started this job, everybody would say to me, "Are you still there?" Because people like me would bounce off the public sector. Now we have a structure. Somebody with a commercial background, somebody with a technical background, there's a place for them to go. We have, of course, got to do some pretty deep rewiring. We've had to build career paths for young people coming in who want to have a commercial experience. By the way, we do more commercial stuff in the civil service than any company in this country. We do more technical stuff in the civil service than any company in this country. We have more property. We do more of everything in the public sector than any company in this country. And the question, therefore, is why wouldn't I want, as a young person, to cut... God, I'm only about 10th of the way through. Why wouldn't I, as a young person... He just gave me a sign saying, "Shut up, get on." As a young person, come in and get that experience, 10 years experience in a sort of year. So we've got to build some career paths. We've done all that. I'm going to skip. Of course, it starts with these people, right? So the point is, this is an accelerating wheel. We have now got structures that people can say, actually, I'm going to go and join the public sector because you know what? The jobs are more interesting. Actually, they're more important than making money somewhere. You can go off and make money if you need to, and some people certainly need to, and they deserve to, and they want to. And I say, go and earn some money and actually come back, because most of the time, you'll find earning money isn't all there is in life. You pay, nobody's starving. But you can go and earn more money in the private sector, but actually, you know what? Most people decide it's not as interesting, I'm coming back. And so we should be much more fluid at the boundary. We should be much more permeable at the boundary between the public and the private sector. All of that we've got to work on. Much more important, though, of course, back to the leadership point, it starts to change the leadership model. It starts, as I always say, you can do policy with intellect. You cannot do delivery with intellect. Delivery needs experience. And so the question is, how do I give the young civil servants of the future, the leadership of the public sector of the future, the deep experience which they can then use? And of course, when you speak from experience, you are not a child to any political parent, because you have something that you own. The politicians can own the what. I want the civil service to own the how. And you can only own the how if you've had the experience to understand it. I'm going to tell you a very brief story. Part of my life, I told you I was sitting on the main board of BP. I spent 6 or 7 years doing that, running one of the most complicated businesses that I've ever seen. It was basically everything except the exploration and production business in BP. It was the trading, it was the marketing, it was the chemicals. We did all the BP petrol stations that you see and introduced Marks and Spencers and did the rebranding and did all that. But in amongst that was the refining business. There were 30 refineries we had around the world. And one day, in 2005, Texas City blew up. Texas City was a massive refinery. We had bought it in from Amoco. I actually ran the integration between BP and Amoco several years before. 5,000 people went to work every day in Texas City. It's in the deep south of Texas. 15 people died. 270 people were injured in that explosion. And of course, as you can imagine, my life for the next 2 years, I was still at BP, was consumed by what had happened, what we had done wrong. And the truth is, what we were doing at the top of BP, we were allocating resources. A guy called John Brown, who was my boss, who ran BP for many, many years. We were allocating resources between the refining business and the upstream business, and we were doing all of that stuff. And actually, the truth is, I believe we allocated it wrong. We did not understand the issues associated in that refinery. We did not understand the fact that it was a 40 or 50-year-old refinery. We hadn't put the maintenance in. And when I spent time, hours and hours and hours, talking to the man who ran that refinery, who was a deep South Texan, if I had brought him to St. James's in London and put him in the boardroom, he would have frozen. He would not have been able to speak. He would not have understood. But in his gut, he knew something was wrong. Over the year or two before that accident, he knew something was wrong in his gut. And what had actually happened, I'm an engineer actually, I pride myself, I've spent 2 years of my life on oil rigs, on the drill floor, I've dug roads, I've done all sorts of stuff. I pride myself in being able to talk to the front line. But I missed that. And one of the reasons I missed what was happening is because the people who had it in their gut couldn't get it through the levels of generalists to the top of BP. There were too many generalists between me on the board and that refinery manager. And the lesson, of course, is you've got to understand the implications of what you're doing up here on the ground. Hopefully in the civil service, people don't die. They do in the oil and gas industry if you get it wrong. BP then went on and got some other things wrong. But the point is, you have to be able to allow the specialists to blossom. And as a leader, as a top leader, you've got to know how to hear the specialists who don't speak your language. They're not in suits and ties. They don't come to boardrooms. They've got it in here, and they don't have it here. They don't have that. They do it. It comes from here. So lesson 1, listen to the specialists. Lesson 2, you've got to have a hypothesis. So what I did, I've told you my hypothesis. It wasn't altogether popular, but the hypothesis was about the lack of those specialist skills, too much generalism. It was about the silos, all of that stuff. And that allowed me to, has allowed me to create a slightly different vision for what I think our civil service in this country needs to be. And so, sort of big point 2, I suppose, what is the hypothesis? You have to have a hypothesis, because otherwise you're talking in theory. It has to be a hypothesis that is situation specific. I said leadership happens in a context, right? I'm not interested in a theory. I'm interested in what you're going to do right now in this organization today. And that's important. Third, I think leaders need authenticity. I think you need something which gives you an authenticity. Every time I talk about Texas City, you probably heard, it still affects me. That was 50, however many years ago it was, 30 years ago. It still affects me because it's seared into my being. Those deep lessons, we only learn when we really screw it up. And when you make mistakes in life, the question isn't that you make a mistake, because if you put yourself in a difficult position, if you put yourself out there, you're going to make some mistakes. That is not the issue. I'm only interested in what you do as a result of making a mistake. How do we learn? How do we move forward? Some of the greatest people I know have made the biggest mistakes. And the only question is, what have they learned when they get? So there's a system of authenticity. From where do you derive authenticity as a leader? Next, confidence. I think, not hubris, but a confidence. I would say there's something about being centered, something about confidence coming from the inside. It's not about, oh look, who can I be seen with? I'm not interested in that. It's what you get from the inside. Where do you get your confidence from as a leader? And I think it's worth thinking about, because I believe it important that you can speak from that confidence. For me, in the public sector, it is I'm the chief executive, I'm not the cabinet secretary, I'm not the head of the civil service. Of course, I'm in some of the political meetings. Actually, that's not what I'm about. What I'm about is how do I take this fantastic group of people and help them get stuff done better. That's what I'm about. It gives me a confidence I can speak from that. I'm not trying to climb some other ladder. So the question is, where do you get your confidence from? The next one for me is, as a leader, how do you... we're all buffeted from outside things all the time. And it's really easy for us to be in a position where we sort of say, oh, I can't do that. That's made life too difficult. Our responsibility as a leader is to create an environment in which others can be in control of their destiny. And what's the most exhausting thing in life is if you're not in control of your agenda, if somebody's pulling you from pillar to post, And it is one of the most important things that if we could create an environment in which people can feel in control, it doesn't matter what they feel in control of, but our responsibility as a leader is to give them that control. How do you make people feel control of their own destiny? And then you can get the best out of them. I better shut up, really, because I suppose the only other thing I'll say, it's very interesting, I'm here in the middle of the greatest military establishment in the world, and of course, the military have this, they have a really great leadership style. They have a great, it is command and control, right? I mean, it is command and control. And what's interesting is companies do that sometimes too. I've run lots of crises. We flip into command and control mode because it gets stuff done. Because the rest is all this sort of woolly, airy stuff, letting people, do their own thing, empowerment and all of those things. It's very interesting. This is back to leadership in a context. In general, we've just got to understand. So I haven't talked about, it's a joy, I've not talked about Brexit all talk. But interestingly, suddenly we're getting down to the short strokes on Brexit, and people are calling for the centre of government to get more grip. Normally they spend their life saying, get the hell out of my way, get off, but now, when you get to the short strokes, people say, you've got to get more grip, John, you've got to get more central control of the activities. So the question as a leader is how fast to move in that direction, how fast not to, because they spend their life telling us to get out of the way from the centre. And one of the most sophisticated judgments, I think, as a leader is, what is the context, how much of the in-your-face, how much of the sitting back. My general, and I'll end on this, my general advice to people, there's only two things leaders do, other than when you're told to get a grip. But the two things that leaders do really are set context for people, because actually it's remarkable, with the same context, people generally make the same judgment. You don't issue instructions if they've all got the same context. Set context and develop other people. Those are the two golden rules for me in terms of leadership. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm being ushered off the stage.
Not quite off the stage yet, so we're going to jump. We've got time, I think, for three very quick questions. I'm going to go to the top question, which is, could any organisation benefit from hiring in external leadership occasionally, rather than always relying on homegrown talent?
I think the answer to that is, yes, of course. But you've got to be pretty careful, because, as I say, every organisation has its own context. And the question, I suppose, is you've got to be pretty thoughtful if you're hiring in external, because there's a lot of implications. You sort of irritate everybody else because you put a blocker in the way of their own progress as you hire in somebody from the outside. I did start. I had an advantage. I hired all the functional leaders. They're very senior people in the government. I hired all the people at the top of the matrix. The good news was nobody knew what a functional leader was, so there wasn't getting anybody's way. So that was okay. It was unthreatening in that sense. It's getting a bit more threatening now, but it was an unthreatening act. So I think, of course, it's always good to get different perspectives. I always find, though, you always know when you go into a new organisation. I always say to people, you know what? You're going to know more in a week than you know today. You're going to know more in a year than you know in a week. You're going to know more in 2 years than you know. And our question is, how carefully do you judge the people that you're bringing in are going to listen, absorb the context, understand the context, and work with the grain to move an organisation, especially a big one, from A to B. If it's a small organisation, you can just flip it around and you can move it. But if it's a big organisation, it's usually bigger than an individual. And the question is, how do you work with the grain in order to move it over time?
So I lied. I'm going to go to one more question, actually, to try and keep us on timings. Don't fear, all of the questions on slide here, we will print off and make sure that the speakers get copies of all of the questions that have been asked. And there are a lot for yourself, sir. So finally, what is your top takeaway tip for us to start doing on Monday?
What are you doing? What's going on? What is my top takeaway tip? Remember those two things at the end. How well, as a leader, how well are we developing others? And all of us can do better than that. At that. Every day we can think about, are we developing others better? I just think the leader's role. And this is, I mean, it's such a stark thing in the civil service. When I got there, it was all about me, me, me. It was all about who's in front of the minister, who's up first. By the way, the interesting thing about Brexit is when you put a big, complicated organisation like the civil service into a thing like Brexit, you know, everybody runs around, they're all bumping into each other. I'm spending an extraordinary amount of time stopping people bumping into each other. And actually, if more people were thinking about the task, as opposed to leveraging themselves into, you know, their own thing, so I would say go and think about developing everybody else.
So thank you so very much for giving up time today. We know you have an immensely busy diary, and you've really transitioned us from our first two speakers who have given us some real themes to think about into your own reflections from a personal experience perspective. So we really thank you.